1956, Amilcar Cabral and his comrades founded the African Party for the Independence of Guinea and Cape Verde in Guinea-Bissau, aiming to liberate their nation from the oppressive grip of Portuguese colonialism. Portuguese presence in Guinea-Bissau dates back 500 years and was characterized by trade and, notably, kidnapping, human trafficking, and slave trading until the late 19th century, when it became more about direct exploitation. From then onwards, Portuguese colonialism in Guinea-Bissau was fascist in nature. It was characterized by virtual enslavement, heavy taxation, debt peonage, exploitation of resources, and the brutal suppression of any dissent. In 1974, it was an agrarian society. 95% of the population were peasants who were engaging in rice production. That means the Portuguese weren't interested in economic development, only extraction. The PAIGC was formed in 1956 to fight for their independence, and with the help of an underground trade union organization, they launched strikes against the Portuguese and hoped that industrial action alone would do the job. Eventually, facing the brutality of Portuguese fascism, the PAIGC realized that they had to pick up their guns. They had all their work cut out for them. Something characteristic of Portuguese colonialism was that it provided little to no economic development and was extremely exploitative and extractive. Watch and listen to this clip to gain a sense of this.
Amilcar Cabral, aged 43, Secretary General and founder of the party in 1956. One of only 14 Africans from Guinea ever to gain a university degree under the Portuguese. Trained in Lisbon as an agricultural engineer, he comes from the same student generation that produced the rebel leaders in Angola and Mozambique.
We think that all the time there still be colonies in Africa. Africa will not be really independent. We think that our people have the obligation to liberate our country. See? To contribute for the liberation of Africa. We think that doing what we are doing, we are proving that we are Africans, we are men, and we are conscious of our rights in the context of the story of our time.
At the time of their independence, the PAIGC had not just liberated 2/3 of the country, but also had introduced schools, people's stores, hospitals, a judiciary, and local and regional government with free elections in areas that had seen none of these things during Portuguese colonialism. The PAIGC was also committed to the liberation of women. In some cases, peasant women who couldn't read or write were even sent to the Soviet Union to learn literacy and even had to be nurses. But things weren't all perfect. Even on the record, Cabral himself complained about certain commanders who would use their power in the liberation struggle to actually engage in sexual violence. As Cabral put it, a party officer or leader whose concern wherever he goes is to look for the most beautiful girls and conquer them is acting even worse than a Portuguese agent. First, because he's undermining the possibility of dignifying and elevating the women of our land. Secondly, because he is a bad example to everyone else, to other leaders, militants and combatants. And beyond that, he demobilizes our people. And thirdly, he ruins his own mind as a leader and a responsible one. Indeed, the research of Galvao and Larenjeiro excavates the testimonies of some of the survivors of this sexual violence, which, as thinkers like Gayatri Spivak have been careful to note, have their counterparts throughout the history of other anti-colonial struggles as well. To explore both the on-the-record and off-the-record stories of women fighting the liberation struggles against Portuguese colonialism, we're joined by Ines Galvao and Catarina Larenjeiro, researchers who are currently based in Lisbon, Portugal. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks for inviting us and hosting us, Mohammed. Good afternoon.
So first things first, what opportunities were opened up for women who joined national liberation movements during the era of Portuguese colonialism?
I mean, I will let to Ines to answer this because she interviewed Stephanie Jordan, who was who wrote the book Fighting Two Colonialisms, and I think that through there we can guess what was the influence of this struggle for women on the West world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes, I don't know if we should see it as opportunities with this big keyword, but in fact, there was a time during the liberation struggle. Just to make a first note, maybe PAIGC was founded by men only, and during a period, the first years, it wasn't open for female militants. Okay, there is in fact a story told told by Carmen Pereira, one of the main female figures in the liberation years, and afterwards, actually, in Guinea-Bissau, where she describes pretty clearly that PAIGC initial militants didn't trust women to accomplish political tasks during, obviously, the dictatorship and many pressures from PIDE, the political police, and other forms of repression. It was a time of undercovered actions, obviously. So in the first years, there was not much openness for female participation. It gradually started to happen, as in other contexts. The other day I was reading Fanon's text on women in Algeria, the unveiling of Algeria, and it was a very similar situation, so it seems. But gradually, yes, we have to think or to imagine a bit that these were years where in Portugal, especially in Portugal, but maybe worldwide, there was this strong ideology of domesticating women, even though many working class women and other were working outside of homes. It was a very domesticated frame for women in general. Also for the first female militants, and their roles were somehow adapted to this context. Even so, PAIGC opened through international networking, mainly with the socialist partners and the Soviet Union. They worked through opening stages for female participation, and it was also expanding, for instance, and this is why I think Catarina mentioned Stephanie Oordang, even in New York, for the feminist groups, the figure of then considered third world women fighting in guerrillas in Vietnam and Cambodia and other contexts like Guinea-Bissau. It was a very powerful icon and a powerful reference for broadening women's political participation and for rethinking and the roles usually ascribed to women in general, and also to question some. We in Portugal we call it esquerdomachismo, left-wing machism, sexism. That was very common, even in Black Panthers and other circles. So there is this constant connection, worldwide connection, when the solidarity movements get to contact with this sort of iconography, these images, these very powerful images that were being broadcasted by movements like PAIGC and also others. I don't know if this is directly answering to your question. There is this ideological influence, so to speak, in the big for the big narratives, but then more specifically, some women got to have training in to be nurses, and afterwards they got to make their lives after the independence, having financial and other types of autonomy that are not very common in a context like Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, for instance. So let's say that the struggle was this context for recreating the gender roles, and PAIGC and Cabral openly subscribed to this egalitarian narrative that was something broader than PAIGC, but also it was very new for a context like Guinea-Bissau, and especially for the Portuguese-speaking context. So,
can I add something? Yeah, I mean, like, women who were enrolled in PAIGC, mainly like those as Carmen and Pereira, who were like in the high grades. And they were participating, for instance, in the Women's International Democratic Federation, and also in the Women's World Congress and so on. A lot of women's emancipation circles and the dynamics that were happening in the 60s and the 70s. And at the same time, of course, that the struggle of PAIGC was extremely influenced for the Carnation Revolution. Like PAIGC declared its independence in 1973, even before the end of the war. So, and was not recognized by the United Nations, but was recognized by several countries as Cuba, Soviet Union, and so on. But, I mean, concerning women emancipation, I don't know really well. It's a very good question, but I'm not sure if it was like a huge influence or not, because the contaminations occur like in the war dynamics, and the war, like the struggle, the colonial liberation war, was mainly performed and led by men. Although there were several women, and like as Carmen Pereira, that we will talk about her deeply, that of course, like people in Portugal knew her, or the left wing knew her, and she was acknowledged as a leader, as a female leader. But I don't know. I don't think that the influence of the women emancipation political program specifically have a deep connection with the Carnation Revolution. The war, yeah, for sure. The struggle, yes, no doubt.
There's someone who was central to the struggle of women in Guinea-Bissau. She was even Africa's first female president, Carmen Pereira. You all spoke to her during your research. Tell us about her.
I mean, she was an outstanding woman, let's say, for her time. She was born in 1936. Yeah, and she was among, I mean, she was married with someone who, please, Ines, add details if you want. Like, she was married with a husband, and she was someone that overpassed her husband. I don't remember her husband's names, but she's really, and even her father was also an important lawyer, and I don't know his name by heart, but Carmen Pereira was someone that in the end, she was like the first woman to be like president in Guinea-Bissau, and she was also prime minister, I guess, and she was the health minister. I mean, she occupied several important state cadres after independence, and she has like a very, very interesting story. I mean, she ran away with her kids to Senegal, where Ines, please help me with some details.
Carmen Pereira was the daughter of an attorney of Cape Verdean origin, I think. And she was raised as a Catholic in somehow bourgeoisie of Bissau. Okay, her father forbid her from going further on her studies, and then she learned how to sew with the Portuguese women. Meanwhile, she got married with someone who happened to be a militant, undercover militant of PAIGC. And she recalls some parties, home parties, hosted by Cabral and others in Bissau, where there was dancing and music and food, and somehow the men always got to meet in a room behind closed doors to talk about politics behind women's back. And meanwhile, Carmen found out that her husband was involved with PAIGC in a time where PID, the political state police, was heavy on the persecution of militants and other people that were against the regime. And her husband ran away to Senegal. She went after him with their 3 children. And meanwhile, she set a home in Ziguinchor, close to the border between Senegal and Guinea-Bissau, where she lived with her kids, and also she hosted militants fleeing from the war, some of them wounded, some other not. There she sewed a lot of clothes for more or less wealthy people. So she got to manage to have money to have this home to feed people, to buy medicine, to she individually, obviously with the help of some other militants based in Zinguinchor, but without her or not under her husband's influence directly, she got an important role there, and then PAIGC acknowledged this role. And as she used to tell, that's when Cabral called her to Conakry to see if she was interested in getting more serious in PAIGC. And from there, she went to Moscow for a political course with other 8 militants from PAIGC, all of them men. Afterwards, she was a political commissar, the only woman being a political commissar in during the struggle. And also she mentored, I think this was the story that you were referring to, she mentored 1 or 2 groups, I think 2 groups of girls that went from the liberated areas to Kiev to have a course in first help and nursing, to obviously go back to the battlefield and help with the wounded soldiers. And during this course, can you just imagine, we are talking about girls that are coming from a peasant context. They do not even speak Creole, some of them, to begin with, and they are having courses in Russian. So there was this very complex translation scheme that I think it's very interesting.
The Russian to Spanish and then Spanish to Creole. So yeah, to point out that some of them didn't speak Creole because they spoke the ethnic language, so Balanta, Fulani, and so on. Yeah.
So in Kiev, so you imagine coming from Guinea-Bissau, Guinea-Conakry, and going to Kiev. It's a very different context in terms of clothing, in terms of what you eat, with the weather. It's a school. So Carmen recalled this period as a period where she gained her title as Tia Carmen, so the aunt Carmen. She had a very close relation with all these girls. And she was there mentoring, somehow assuming a mother role for them, somehow teaching them how to, well, this is quite difficult to describe, but today it seems like she was educating them in habitus, in a way of being, a way of behaving, a way of dressing, more westernized way, maybe, how to sit at the table, how to dress properly, learning how to write, how to read, and so on. How to cook also, this is very important, because how to cook for their future husbands and other men, but not the traditional rice, but French fries and fried eggs, for instance.
And we were like in a peasant context, and where the people had the label of indigenous. That was a really strong label. And so for Carmen and for, let's say, for the more well-educated layer of the PAIGC, so a way to jump out of this category that colonialism had labeled them, like of indigenous, was like a way to demonstrate this kind of more Western behaviors and habitus. But of course we can be like quite critical of it nowadays, but we have to analyze that in the context of that times, of that struggle, and how we're doing like their best in order to overcome what was like the legacies of the colonialism, of the colonial rule. Yeah.
This very strong idea of dignity You have to set apart the idea of the indigenous that stopped in time and cannot be any other way, to reclaiming some sort of modernity, and especially this dignity in terms of intelligence, in terms of capability, in terms of being part of the modern world. And also, obviously, of assuming very important tasks and very important roles during the war. Okay, they were being trained to be nurses, in order to political commissars. Some of them, not many, and this is a question that we tried to talk a bit about and reflect a bit about on our text, on our article, is that some few women actually had military training, not all of them. This is a complicated issue in all liberating movements back then and afterwards also. But they were acquiring and they were being projected to the modern world somehow. And this was how PAIGC and how socialist movements back then imagined an emancipatory trajectory for them. And in fact, it had consequences, as we were speaking before.
Carmen also found UDEMU in 1963, even before the war. That was the Democratic Union of Women of Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde. And that concerning that this is a very important point of PAIGC that is quite controversial, that contrary to Angola and Mozambique, women didn't perform military roles in the battlefront. What they were taught to defend themselves in the village. And this is something that is very important to talk about women's roles in the war, in the guerrilla war, because the women were taking care of the crops, were taking care of the families of the kids, and the men were all at the battlefronts. They need to defend themselves. And so they were those who support the war in that level, this kind of the home front of the war that is usually is not given too much academic attention and journalistic attention. What is this home front that they were there? And usually when the women get extremely tired is that when war are over.
What international organizations was she involved in?
Although Carmen was involved in all these activities, at the same time, she was in contact with several international organizations, such as the Women's International Democratic Federation. She also participated in the Women's World Congress. She was with a group of 10 militants. Did you already told that she went to Moscow in 1961 to do to attend a political course. And also in 1963, even before the start of the war, she found the UDEMU, that is the Democratic Union of Women of Guinea-Bissau. And so she was, at the same time that she was very active, locally speaking, at the same time she was really well internationally connected, let's say. So that was something that was very important. In Guinea-Bissau, as you told in your introduction, is a very, very, very small country, and it's important to say that to repeat that they declared independence before the end of the war, so in September 1973, and that was really thanks to this diplomatic capacity of the PAIGC. That was one of the best, and is still nowadays a reference for a lot of, let's say, even to Afro-descendant groups and so on, diasporas, and not only in Africa, but in several contexts, and something that extrapolates the Portuguese-speaking world, let's say. Yeah.
Those are amazing stories. I really like the story you gave on Cabral, who en route to Moscow visited these women in Kiev and joked to them that it was his theory that Carmen Pereira was actually ghostwriting the letters they were sending him. But he was happy to find out that, in fact, not only could they read and write, but that they were also very capable nurses. In Carmen Pereira's own stories, she told you, and she mentions that many of these women didn't even know how to use a knife and fork and had never drank from a glass. The history of the PAIGC is obviously replete with stories like this. It really did liberate many women to join the movement. But as we discussed in the intro, there was also a more complicated off-the-record story as well, wasn't there? Can you tell us what you found in your fieldwork when you were assessing this?
So we were both like in different parties, but we of Guinea-Bissau, but we were exchanging, and sometimes we were together and we were discussing it. That somehow what is amazing about doing field work and about ethnographic work is that we learn things of the voice of below. I don't know what that means, but yeah, we were like in place where that were like former liberated areas where women would tell us about that were, I don't know, raped within the party, or that some, I mean, there was like that were like means of privilege and oppression there, and also something that really shocked us, let's say, that the mobilization was not volunteer, but that was forced to. And somehow it's like the struggles and the wars are full of contradictions, and we don't have to be afraid of the contradictions. I mean, it's very difficult to understand that, and it's very difficult to combine this, and this was something that we tried to do and was not all the time easy to do, and it's very easy to be moralist and to judge, but to try to understand why that things happen and why very different transcripts and stories about the same period and about the same struggle from people that were in the same side of the struggle, all fighting against the Portuguese colonial rule, can have different memories today. And was that trying to look for these contradictions and to look for what is off the record, what are the stories of the women that end up not being part of the big history, what can they learn, what we can learn from them nowadays. And yeah, go on.
It's important to remember and have in mind that we are talking about a war that lasted for 11 years. I mean, we've met old men and women that were engaged in the war when they were 10, 11, and they came out of age during the war, carrying weapons and other military material from the borders to the liberated areas, to the fronts, to the various fronts of the war, and as usual, we're not. It's a war. Although we can speak today of the liberated areas with some romanticism, we have to keep in mind also that because PAIGC won the war, they got the chance to establish a victorious narrative, somehow marginalizing the difficulties of that and the PAIGC and the contradictions that PAIGC faced in the front. And it's also important to notice that during these 11 years of war, PAIGC leadership tried to deal with some issues regarding sexual abuse, regarding forced labor, regarding witchcraft accusations, and regarding other contradictions arising from the relationship of the military, the guerrilla military, and the local population. PAIGC coined this idea of the total revolution, okay? That the big transformation was taking place during the war, yes, but there was a second revolution to take place after the war in building up a state, a socialist state, possibly, with schools, with public health, and so on. And the liberated areas, which have this beautiful name and which can convoke beautiful imaginaries and very romantic, they hosted many contradictions, in fact. And Catarina was, before speaking of the PAIGC victory, a big part of the PAIGC victory was obviously in the diplomatic arena. This arena was fed with images and discourses and representations of what was happening in the liberated areas. There were visits of international and solidarity militants and organizations, And there was obviously a part of staging the war for these networks, for this diplomatic effort. And as anthropologists, as people with a connection with fieldwork and already hearing many stories told from this period, also because we are Portuguese and this a way of people connecting with us is starting to tell us stories of the war and this time, tempo de colon, tempo antigo and tempo de guerra and so on, tempo de luta. We had this sensibility of the many layers that are interconnected and sometimes are contradictory, but are really just part of life. And especially during a very, very violent war, where PAIGC tried to mobilize a whole population and to build up something new, obviously with a pretension to build up a nation also, in a time where also Portuguese colonial power was using a very strong ideological tools and a very strong ideological program with food help, with new villages and so on. It was a real complex struggle, as I think many struggles are for us, and in our political engagements, maybe it's important to keep with this idea of complexity, of layers, and of violence, and of the effects, the uncontrollable aspects of violence. I believe that all political movements that engage in a guerrilla war, being the Zapatistas, being the FLN in Algeria, being whatever, they all have these challenges. Okay, we are talking about people that are living in very strained conditions, in very difficult conditions, and usually the masculinist environment doesn't help, as we can imagine. Okay, it doesn't help. So it's actually quite interesting that female participation was inserted in this context in a time where also in the West it wasn't a resolved question. It isn't yet. Okay, we had this big socialist-inspired effort of bringing equality between women and men. We have, in this same period, feminists starting to criticize the left-wing machismo in the New Left and Black Panthers and so on in New York and other places. So it's actually a very bubbling period where anything is resolved. So when Cabral goes to New York and he meets with Solidarity militants, and Stephanie Woerden, who wrote Two Colonialisms, meet him, he's showing pictures of women holding arms and holding babies in an arm, which is a quite powerful, iconic image from that time. This image of an African woman holding a baby in one arm and holding a gun in another arm, this image brought new things to New York women, feminists, okay? So this interconnectedness of the struggles, worldwide speaking, it's so inspiring in a way, and it's so more complex than close narratives of victories. We need to have a more complex and more not judging eye on this, or not an immediately judging perspective on these movements. But I think what's happening was very, very interesting at the end. At least it was very, very interesting, and it's I think it's good to keep that in mind.
This is a question to the both of you. Despite all of the contradictions we've explored, how can anti-colonial feminism inspire feminists today?
Other day we were talking about this text that we wrote back in 2018, and I was saying to Ines, one day we will have to write that we were also writing about us and about our life in academia and about our life in left-wing movements and so on, and how several ideas and problems and contradictions that we found hearing stories from that struggle, we keep seeing them being reproduced in several different contexts, and we are all the time finding out new patterns, of course, but also old patterns of sexism, let's say. And just before this conversation, Ines came here and said, like, there are no poor feminism. And I think that is a very strong idea that we have to accept, that this field of women emancipation, and this is very funny because we don't find like words or sentences like gender equality in the 60s. We find women's emancipation. That was something really different. So we were quite far from gender parity. That is probably something that we are struggling today in our work context, family context, and so on. And this, that we, anytime that we are like that we are struggling, or that we are looking for like women's emancipation or gender parity, we are finding new paradox and new contradictions that we cannot solve, and we are dealing with old problems again. And it's something that should not let us to give up, but to understand that things are more complex and have more layers, and as Ines just said, and that is very challenging to understand what is anti-colonial feminist movements in all this complexity.
We were talking at the beginning of our meeting here that tomorrow in Portugal we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Carnation Revolution, the 25th of April of 1974. That was obviously propelled by the liberation struggles in Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, Angola, and Mozambique, that were taking place already for 13 years. And today in Portugal, I don't know if you're aware, Mohammed, or anyone listening to this, we are watching, not passively, I hope, but we are watching for a renewal of very conservative perspectives and narratives on the woman role, on what is a family. And I think it's hopefully this militant historical repertoires and this revolutionary repertoires will continue to inspire us, not in a flattened manner, not just by simple adoring and engaging with the iconography of that time, but also by diving into its complexities. As Catarina was saying, every day we face challenges, and I think probably what was more engaging for us, or more compelling in the stories that we were collecting, was the fact that we were somehow unconsciously projecting ourselves and our situations also there in this historical period, and what these women were sharing with us. And yes, I'm not the most optimistic person in the world, but I think the last years brought important voices and discussions for feminism worldwide, mainly in the decolonial area of feminism. I know you interviewed Françoise Weber very recently, which is obviously a big reference for us also. But I don't know, we are somehow inheriting challenges posed by Spivak and other people that made us quite aware of the different textures of voices, silences, and yes, just to underline what Catarina was saying, there is we don't have a key for every situation. I don't think we need a key for all situations. I think we have to depart from what we have. As we were talking before during lunchtime, we look at Carmen Pereira and other figures, and we can acknowledge that she was a Catholic woman, a mother, a militant. Probably somehow she had her conservative perspectives on what a woman should be. But she was what she was, and she brought so much. She affected so many people, so many women that still today recall her as the sweet aunt that hold them to be today in places that they couldn't imagine to be if it wasn't for Kiev course, or if it wasn't for the PAIGC fight against Portuguese colonialism, which again, it was a very, very, very conservative fascism.
We talk about iconography today, and I think it's important to point out that it's always necessary to go behind iconography to look what is behind, what is further there. And I think this is something that we can learn from that story. From the story of the women in this struggle and in all the struggles, I mean.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We'd love to hear your feedback. Please follow us on all the socials and subscribe to our YouTube.
Thank you, Mohammed.
It was great. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us on Decolonial Dialogues.